pollinator is doing is moving pollen from the anther to the stigma to help produce fruit and seeds. So these are done in plants that we call simple or complete flowers. So such as a tomato, where the male pollen, which is the anther, or the stigma, which is the female up at the top, is getting transferred back and forth. When an animal is moving pollen from one flower to another flower that might have a only male parts on one flower and then female on the other, they're having to go those back and forth. And an example of that is squash plants. So I don't have a picture of that one here, but if next time you have any sort of squash or cucumbers, take a look at the flowers and you will see a very distinct difference between a male flower and a female flower. It's pretty interesting to be able to see. And it's one of the reasons why we do need those insects to help move that pollen back and forth. So some of the different types of pollinators that we have, oftentimes people think of and know of bees and wasps and different butterflies, but we also have ants, beetles, and then also thinking about some of our larger animals such as birds and mammals. So mice and rabbits, deer, bats, bears, and even us as humans. So if you think about it, anytime we're walking through a forest or through a flower garden and we might brush up against something, we are also helping to pollinate different types of plants as we move that pollen back and forth. There's many different types of pollination, and oftentimes these have to do with the types of animals that are moving them or the different ways that they are moved. So we have biotic, which is the more physical movement of them, and looking at zoophily, which is the transfer of pollen by mammals. And oftentimes this is a mutually beneficial. So it's not only getting nectar or a food source to the mammals, they're also then creating the fruit or the seed down the road. Oftentimes with these types of flowers or plants, the flowers are attractive by smell or color, and then also sometimes can start to mimic different types of animals. And that's same with the different insects too. They can start to mimic them as they go through. And I'm going to not be able to say this name right, but the chiropterophily, the transfer of pollen by bats. And oftentimes this is when we see in a lot of different fruits. So bananas, mangoes, and guava. And oftentimes bats are also attracted to white or very light colored flowers and ones that bloom at night. Ornithophily is the transfer of pollen by birds. And most often it's nectar feeding birds that we see this happen with. And with a lot of them, it's more tubular flowers, such as the hummingbirds and the flowers that they are attracted to. We have entomophily, which is the transfer of pollen by insects, and is probably one of the largest types that we see, with a huge amount of different insects that are winged, but also crawling at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of coevolution that has happened between the animals and the plants to help attract them. One of the really cool ones is the different types of orchids. If you look at some of the orchids, orchids have morphed to actually change the flowers to almost mimic the animal or the insect that is pollinating them. So do a Google search on that and you'll be able to see some really cool adaptations of the way things look and who's being attracted to them. And then we have abiotic, and this is the anemophily, so wind pollination, where no animals are actually involved. And I think corn is a really good example of that. It's the most common one that you would see where wind pollination is so important. So to go a little bit deeper into the different types, so bird pollination, there's 2,000 different species globally. And many of them, as I mentioned before, are nectar feeders, and many are mostly tropical birds. There is this strong perch kind of way that they do it, except for hummingbirds, where they're actually physically moving and flying as they're getting the different nectar and pollen from the different types of flowers that they're attracted to. So with the hummingbirds, some of the ones that we see here in the Northwest, the Annas and the Rufus, the Calliope and the black-chinned. The Annas is a year-round resident, so they do winter over here in the Northwest. They are very territorial at their feeders. So if you've ever had a hummingbird feeder out and you see one fly up and another one kind of chase it away, a lot of times that can be the different hummingbirds kind of protecting their little flower. They have very long bills to be able to get deep down into those tubular types of flowers. And they oftentimes are attracted to the red, orange, and yellows, but those aren't the only colors. Those are just some of the more brighter ones, which is why you oftentimes see hummingbird feeders with those hot, warm colors. The pollen is deposited on the base of the bill and their foreheads. And so as they move from flower to flower, that is how they are then transferring that and helping to help pollinate some of our different flowers. Moths and butterflies are nectar feeders and can travel very long distances and often longer distances than many bees. So depending on how far away some flowers are, such as the monarch is traveling from Mexico all the way up into the mountains up here in the United States. So as you can see, they're very long travelers and they're pollinating all along the way as they go up. Pollen collects all over their legs and bodies, and they oftentimes then they can also source that nectar. The one interesting thing with moths and butterflies and some other types of insects is that they do go through a complete metamorphosis where they go through that egg, larva, pupa, and adult stage. And I will have some examples of some of these as we go through some of the other slides. Oftentimes, the larvae and the adults do have different host plants. And so it's important to have a diversity in habitat when we are creating and looking at trying to keep many of these different types of animals around. Their lifespans can range from anywhere from 10 days to 10 months, depending on the species and also the size. They oftentimes are perching on flowers. Wide and flat flowers are some of their favorites. It's easier for them to kind of be stable and to sit on. And they actually use the ultraviolet ranges when looking for different types of nectar, which can play a role in the different types of flowers and colors that they're looking for. With moths, we have some pretty interesting ones, and I have some more specifics as we go down the road. But the elegant sheep moth is a pretty cool looking moth with its really vibrant colors and just almost odd shape body as they go through. There is over 1,200 different species of moths in the Pacific Northwest alone. And the moths can range from 1/10 of 1 inch all the way up to 6 inches in wingspan. So you can get some pretty large moths out there. Generally, they are active at night. They are feathered or have thread or thickened antennas. So it's one of the ways to be able to tell them apart from an actual butterfly. Their wings are held horizontally or hugged around the abdomen, and they make silk cocoons. Most of the more colorful types of moths, such as that elegant sheep moth, you're going to see more during the daytime versus some of the lighter colored ones, which you would see at night. We also have some that are at risk of being endangered, and such as the sand verbena moth. And oftentimes, habitat loss is one of the largest impacts of the reduced populations, and not only moths, but also many of our other types of insects. Butterflies have knobs on the ends of their antenna and can hold their wings up over their body, especially when warming up. So another way to think about when trying to decipher between the two is thinking about how their wings are laying up against them. They, unlike the moths, need a warmer environment, so around 60 degrees to be able to actually get up and fly around. And so you don't normally see them until it starts to warm up from like March until April or until October. Oftentimes, the colorful wings are for attracting a mate and then also can be for camouflage depending on where they are located. Many of them are plant species dependent. So I mentioned the monarch earlier as being one that travels really far. They're also very dependent on plants such as milkweed. And then the red admiral is very important for the stinging nettle and the Puget blue with the lupin. So Many different types of animals are very specific to those plants. So trying to plant some of these to make sure that they have habitat and are able to either feed or raise their young on is really important. And then once again, urbanization, loss of habitat is some of the reasons why we're seeing a huge decline in many of these different species. So looking at the swallowtail and the monarch, so at the very top here, we have the swallowtail, and you can see on the left the caterpillar or the larva stage of that swallowtail. And this is probably the most common one that I've seen around, with the light yellow and then the orange on the sides. And then down below, we have the monarch with the larva feeding on a milkweed plant, which is their main food source when they are that little, and then the adult on the far side. And there is currently a project to try and incorporate and introduce more monarchs into the Northwest right now. So keep your eyes peeled if you ever see any. It's one we want to keep track of as we're trying to make sure that we can increase their populations again. So when thinking about what pollinators need, or what do we need that they can survive or produce for us, pollinators are really important in actually apples, bananas, peaches, blueberries, and strawberries. So without pollinators, many of these different types of fruits we wouldn't have available to us in grocery stores or on farms. When thinking about nuts, almonds, coconuts, and cashews, avocados, beets, broccoli, carrots, cucumbers, and pumpkins, and then even chocolate, coffee, vanilla, and sugarcane. So all of these foods are almost completely dependent on different types of pollinators, making it even more so a reason why we need to keep a better, closer eye on them and learn more about them. And like I mentioned, the loss of habitat is one of the largest reasons why we're seeing such a decline in many of these pollinators. The use of chemicals and different types of pesticides and herbicides are also causing a huge decrease with the unintentional killing of them as we're trying to control many of the different types of predator or pests that we have in our gardens. And then with the changes of the climate and the different types of environments that we have, we're seeing a lot more different disease issues that are having more problems in many of our different insects. So one of the things that we can really do is focus on increasing habitat. So a habitat is an environment that is occupied by a particular species of plant, animal, or any other kind of organism. Some of the things that are the most important for creating a healthy habitat and that is important for you to be able to think about in your own backyards is adding and including a food source. So whether that's nectar, fallen fruit that it might be fermenting for different types of bees, specific types of plants for larvae, so such as the milkweed. Looking at shelter, so canopy layers. Animals of all different types need different levels. Some birds like to nest in the tallest trees, and some like to nest down on the forest floor. Snags or dead wood for some of the different types of animals like woodpeckers. Bare soil for some of our beetles or some of our ground bees. And then different types of groups of plants and kind of having groups to be able to create kind of a shelter type of a space. Thinking about nesting. So I mentioned the woodpeckers, they use those for the dead wood or snags for not only finding shelter and hiding, but also it's where they raise their young. Bare soil is where our bumblebees oftentimes will be. And there's always, we can make man-made. So looking at bird houses, bat houses, or mason bee houses. Water is something that people oftentimes don't think about or forget about. And we will put water baths out for birds, but many of our insects also need water, especially during the dry times of our year. We do have a drought in the middle of the summer, so it's important to make sure that there is a water source for many of these animals also. So looking at the different types of the fruit that can be on the ground, so you see some of the bees eating some of the different types of rotting fruit, the milkweed for the monarch butterfly, and then the different honeybees that are getting into some of that nectar. We also forget about some of the other types of animals that can be important to add to our habitat. So garter snakes are not poisonous. They are one of our really big slug eaters. So it's really important to be able to create habitat for all the different types of animals that we have. Bumblebees need that bare soil to be able to nest in, and lady beetles or the ladybug actually lay their eggs on a lot of times grasses or different types of really long, skinny types of plants. And then their pupa and their larvae are the ones that are actually eating a majority of the bad insects, such as aphids, that we're seeing. So making sure that you're keeping those different little spots for them to be able to lay and to be safe. It's just an example of some bat houses that are put up. I've seen some bat houses put up along the freeways along 520, headed over kind of where 405 and 520 meet. Bats can eat anywhere from 600 to 1,000 insects per hour, and they do need some sort of roost to be able to be in, and a space that is open that goes down, since they are up in something and they fall down to fly out. Blue herons are one of our really good ones for eating really large insects, and they need really, really large trees to be able to nest in. I was fortunate enough as a kid to be able to have a blue heron nest in my backyard. It's pretty cool to watch them being raised up. They can be a little smelly with the different fish that they bring back, but it's pretty cool to be able to see blue herons in your backyard. Hoverflies are actually, their larvae are one of the really, really good predators of different aphids and also some other different types of smaller insects. And they do look like a yellow jacket, but if you look at their eyes and the way that their wings lay, you can tell that they are a fly. So, another thing to just think about with creating habitat, one of the things that you can do for a lot of edible gardens, such as vegetable gardens or some containers, adding cover crops in really helps to not only help to build that healthy soil, which reduces the amount of pesticides or chemicals that we need, it's also producing flowers, depending on what species of crop you're putting in for the different insects in the early, early spring. We can create these man-made structures and create bug hotels or bee hotels to attract many of our different types of insects. Adding diversity and layers and canopy layers in our garden so that everything has a different home and a place that they can hide and shelter. And then trying to use as many native plants as possible, because many of our animals are used to our native plants. They know the food source, they know when they bloom. And it's the best way to make sure that our native animals are also getting that food when they need it. So thinking about nesting, lots of different types of animals need different types of nesting. Bumblebees you can find using old rodent holes, open ground, upside down flower pots, and wood piles. So this picture on the very bottom here is an upside down flower pot with a little piece of a brick put on top, and then a tube that comes out the bottom so that the bumblebees can actually go down and they nest underneath this pot. Carpenter bees are one of our native pollinators that use soft dead wood or stems to be able to make nests in. Leafcutter bees use dead wood and actually put leaves in there. Our mason bees oftentimes will use tunnels. I've seen them in the windowsills, like the cracks on the outside. I've seen them in holes of like old nail holes that are just the right size, and they will end up making their own little nests in there. Sweet bees will use really bare compacted soil. Beetles, such as the picture in the middle, love different types of leaf or litter debris on the ground. Birds will use almost anything. As you can see in the top, the picture of the eggs just in a little moss and kind of fluff pile. And the moths and butterflies really love the native shrubs, and bats, as always, hollow trees and different nesting boxes that we can add into there. So the water, like I mentioned, so some of the things to take note of is some animals like to drink water on the fly. So having some sort of a fountain can help with that sometimes. Oftentimes, like bats will drink water on the fly. Different bees and other types of insects, sometimes it's hard for them to get into really deep with really steep sides. And so having something that's shallow, putting different rocks or pebbles inside so that they have something to land on, is a great way to be able to create a little water source for many of these different types of animals. So thinking about the different types of flowers. So we have there's three main families that we like to think about when we're looking at and thinking about the different types of plants that attract our beneficial insects. So we have the daisy family, which includes anything that kind of looks like a sunflower, dahlias, sunflowers, zinnias, asters, rudbeckia, echinacea, cosmos, marigold, calendula. All of these are great ones to have in your garden. And I just want to do a real quick little snippet of just watching this bee on this little flower. So as you can see, they're just kind of zooming around. They're going from flower to flower, and they're just kind of checking it out. They do leave markers as they go so that they know where they have already been and marking the way so that they can make sure that they're getting and hitting as many flowers as possible. We have the carrot family, and oftentimes I think of these as the ones that's more of kind of like the umbrella type flower. And so we have the carrot, the fennel, dill, cilantro, sweet cicely, angelica, lovage, celery, parsley, cumin, chervil, and erigeron. One of the things I like to do is when I'm growing any of these in my garden, such as carrots or cilantro, which are the most common ones that I have, I will let at least one or two of the plants go to seed so that I can actually have a spot for these different types of insects to come. I oftentimes see some of the smaller guys. So like in this video, the soldier beetle or the parasitoid wasp is what I will end up finding on these different types of flowers. And so this is a cilantro flower right here. And you can see these red beetles. These are a great predatory insect and also a pollinator at the same time. The mint family is in kind of one of the other really classic large families that we focus on. And this is kind of anything that has a lot of times are more tubular type flowers when you start to look at them. So the mints, lavender, sage, oregano, marjoram, bee balm, thyme, rosemary, catnip, and catmint. And some of these are oftentimes what you'll see with some bumblebees and even some hummingbirds will come onto these because they have the longer tongue or beak that needs to get into a really long flower. Rosemary is really cool as a really early one. I have a hummingbird that has been coming up to my rosemary plant for the last couple of weeks now. So it's pretty fun to be able to have them on there. And as you can see, you get a whole bunch of different activity on these different types of plants. I will say with the, just to go back for a sec, the carrot family, some of these, such as the fennel and cilantro, sweet cicely, some of them can be a little invasive. Their seed heads spread far and wide, and same with the mint family is spreading underground. So just being aware of that when you are planting these, that those two families can be a little bit invasive. So just keeping an eye on the seed heads, allowing those flowers to bloom, but maybe catching some of them before they go to array so that they don't take over your entire yard. So with the hummingbirds, as I mentioned, they like the flowers that have the really long, kind of more tubular types of flowers. So such as the agastache, the columbine, fuchsias, monarda or bee balm, rosemary, lobelia, penstemon, and salvia. And here's just a fun little video of the hummingbird going in to one of the different hummingbird feeders. I like to have my hummingbird feeder out. You always want to make sure that you are keeping it clean because any sort of mildew can be really toxic and harmful to them. And if you can, trying to have a diversity of flowers for them so that they are utilizing their natural food source and not always focusing on the sugars that you are putting out in those feeders. So I mentioned a little bit about some of the flower color preferences, and just to kind of go in a little bit more detail, many of the bees like some of the more cooler types of colors of flowers, except for the yellow. But the blues and the purples are some of their kind of main favorites. with butterflies, they like a lot of the hotter, warmer colors. And then looking at moths, they're generally attracted to the light colored flowers and ones that are opening up closer to dusk. So the evening primrose, which is that flower in the middle there, is one of their favorites. Hummingbirds like the hotter, warmer colors. And then, as I mentioned, those tubular flowers. So even something like a nasturtium is something that you will see them after. And then bats like those lighter colored night blooming flowers, so such as a cactus, which we don't have as much here, but we still end up having enough different types of flowers that are out and open for them, along with the different insects that they're eating, that we see many bats around still. So thinking about our garden heroes, we have many different types of garden heroes out there. I've mentioned the hummingbirds and the bats, but we also have ground beetles, and these guys are often left behind, or people don't realize that they are actually such a good animal to have around. They are really good at eating slugs and snails. So for here in the Northwest, where our springs and falls can be slug and snail heaven, making sure we have habitat for these beetles is really, really important. The bush tit is a small, little, tiny white bird that is a huge forager for insects in the garden. And oftentimes I see them out flying around in the fall as some of the seed heads are falling, and you'll see some different insects up along the edges of some of the stems. And then the hoverfly, which I mentioned earlier, not only are going after aphids, but also mealybugs and other little tiny insects. So they're a great predator to have in our gardens. So this is kind of a fun trying to know which beetle is the pest, because they can get very confusing for many different people. So we have the ground beetle and the root weevil. So the root weevil is one of our big pests that we have here in the Northwest. We see them a lot going after rhododendrons. There is different species that are associated with different crops. So there's one that likes rhododendrons. There's one that likes strawberries. There's ones that like, I'm trying to think of the other main crop. Those two are the ones I see the most of. And what happens is the adults will actually climb up and eat the leaves and eat little notches in the leaves. And then the larvae are actually down below eating the roots, which is causing a majority of the biggest problems. Heuchera, I will see it on very good. And you pull it out of the ground and there's no roots left and it's just a little nub. Oftentimes you have a root weevil that has gone in there and chewed everything off. So being aware of those, and finding some of the different predatory insects that will go after them. Also, nematodes can be another great way to control those guys. So to go into a little bit more detail of our different heroes that we have the lady beetle, and they can eat anywhere from 50, sometimes even up to 200 aphids a day. So it's quite a bit when you think about a plant that has a whole bunch of aphids. They will also eat other insects such as mealybugs, scales, and also spider mites. And one thing that people often don't realize is that its young, which is the lower picture here of its larva, is actually the one that's eating more of the different insects than the adult itself. The adult still eats some of the insects, but it's that larva that is really the one that is helping to control the aphids more than anything. We have the green lacewing, and the adults and the larvae will both feed on aphids, leafhoppers, whiteflies, smaller caterpillars, different eggs, and also spider mites. So in this bottom picture, the brown, stripy, kind of crazy alligator thing is the larva of this green lacewing. And then it's eating a caterpillar, which almost looks like the imported cabbage moth caterpillar. So just to kind of give you an idea of size, it's pretty impressive to be able to see something like this going after these different types of insects. So one of my favorites is the parasitic wasp. These guys are super crazy. They actually parasitize their hosts by laying an egg inside of them. They keep the host alive, and then the larva actually eats the aphid or the insect from the inside out. So they go after caterpillars, moths, leaf miners, wood-boring beetle larvae, flies, aphids, gypsy moth, weevils, and even spiders. So they are about the size of the tip of a pencil. So they're very tiny. They do not sting. And as you can see here in the bottom picture, if you ever see this kind of, which almost looks like a little puffed brown rice or a puffed aphid, that is an aphid that has been parasitized by one of these wasps, which is a good thing. It means that you have them in your garden and they are doing their job. I have a video to show of this. It's a little gross, so if you don't, if you are sensitive to kind of some weird stuff like this, just be aware. But it's a pretty cool video just to be able to see them in action and what they're actually doing. And I have it muted because it's a funny narrator. So you can see there the size of the aphids, and then those are the little tiny wasps. And I have all these links to these videos in the resource page on the Bothell website too. So you can see they're almost the size of an aphid. So they're really, really tiny, and they just go through and they are laying an egg, in a single egg into each aphid. And I'm not sure the exact how long it takes. Aphids don't live very long, so it must happen pretty quickly. So as they go through, they can lay hundreds of eggs over a short amount of time. So as you can see here, this is the larva and the egg hatching and developing inside of one of those aphids. So I don't know if you can see the little tiny thing moving around. So the aphid is alive, but it's just unable to move. And the wasp is growing inside of it. So as we get to the end here, those are all the dead ones that a wasp has come out of. So we'll see here in a second the wasp chewing his way out of the dead aphid. So nature is pretty crazy. It's pretty impressive what they have been able to create and do over the years. So if you see that, it's a good thing. You definitely want to increase and have those guys in your yard. So to move on. So once again, looking at some of these different guys and then looking at all their different life stages. And this is one of the really important things to know, because you don't want to be killing something that might be a beneficial insect because it looks so much different or it looks like it might be a bad bug. So the very top here, we have the green lacewing. And so their eggs, they lay on this little tiny string. So it actually keeps them from being eaten by different types of other pests or other predators. So they kind of flow in the wind and allows them to be safer that way. And then as you can see here, here's the larva that is going through and actually eating an aphid. And they actually call these aphid lions because they can do such a good job of going after them. And then they make this little tiny kind of cocoon where then they metamorphose into the adult lacewing. With the lady beetles, we have these little tiny orange, almost tic-tac looking little eggs on the bottom of leaves. And then they have this orange and black striped type of a larva that goes after the different aphids. And then they do this kind of crazy little orange cocoon that then they turn into the adult lady beetle. And then the assassin bug is another common one that we have. And they lay these kind of almost a honeycomb shaped type eggs. They hatch out like this little yellow guy. As they continue to grow, they end up having this orange abdomen and they look kind of like a little alien. And then they turn into this adult assassin bug, which can sometimes be confused with the stink bugs, but stink bugs have more of a square, like diamond shape, whereas these guys are a little bit longer and skinny. So these guys are a good guy, whereas our stink bugs we do not like to have in our garden. So just a list of some of the different predators and the different bugs that they eat. So many of these different things are eating aphids and also leafhoppers and mealybugs and scales. Big-eyed bugs are eating lygus bugs. The lacewings are also eating different types of spider mites and also thrips. The minute pirate bugs are eating different immature stages, so those younger larva stages of different insects. And then we have our parasitoid wasps. So there's a couple of different kinds, and they're eating a lot of the different cutworms, loopers, which is another worm that you're going to see, different fruit moths, and the tortrix moth, which I'm not sure, I don't know of that one specifically. And then the tachinids, which is another type of parasitoid, are eating the different codling moths and the Colorado potato beetle. Corn earworms, cutworms, hornworms, the imported cabbage worms, and different tussock moths and different other plant bugs. So as you can see, there is a large range of different types of pests that are being eaten by just a handful of different predators. And all of these are helpful to have in your garden and need a diversity of flowers. So it's just always important to plant diversity to attract as many of these different guys as possible. When looking at our native bees, we have over 4,000 native bees in Washington state. And it's a shame that we only ever hear about a handful of them. And oftentimes it's the honeybee that we hear the most of, which is a good thing to have, but they honestly are a little bit lazy when it comes to pollinating. So we need to make sure that we have our native bees around to be able to get as many of our different flowers and fruits and vegetables pollinated. We break them up into three main categories: the solitary bee, such as the mason bee, the leafcutter, and the carpenter. What's interesting with these are all named after the way that they pack their nests. So the mason bee has mud or mason, the leafcutter uses a leaf, and the carpenter generally is in more wood and has more wood part worked into their nesting areas. We have our green bees and our small bees. So these are different ground nesting and semi-social bees. We have our bumblebees. There is over 30 different species in Western North America. We oftentimes, I would say the most common that I see is the yellow-faced bumblebee, but we also have the Western bumblebee here. The sweet bees are really cute. They're very shiny green. Our blue orchard mason bee looks almost like a little tiny shiny black fly sometimes when you see them. And then with the leafcutter bee, they make almost a perfect hole punch out of a leaf. And so when they're taking those, they're using those leaves to pack their nests. They're not hurting the plants. They're not going to kill the plants. It might look a little not the most attractive when you have a little punch hole, but they're never going to kill those plants. They're taking just enough to be able to make their nests. So be aware of that. If you think you might have a pest out there, it might just be our leafcutter bee. So as I mentioned, the mason bees are one of our native bees. They're also solitary, which means that they work alone. They don't have a big nest or hive that they're going back to. They are the most active from February through June, which is one of the reasons why I said the honeybees are not as great at pollinating. In some of the times they're lazy. They don't like our cool, wet springs, whereas our mason bees will come out in all weather and they will be out doing a lot of the main work that we have. They don't travel as far as honeybees, so it is important to have food sources for them in multiple different areas. And they're very, very important for our fruit trees because of how early they bloom and the weather that we end up having. So oftentimes we put those honeybees out, but really making sure we have food sources in February to be able to get these guys out and helping them with pollinating our apple trees and our cherry trees is very, very important. So if you've never seen inside of a mason bee tube before, it's pretty cool. So on the bottom here, you can see the female lays eggs in a pile of pollen. And the pollen is there for the larva, once it hatches, to be able to feed and make its way through to grow up into the adult stage before it hatches out back again in February. So what they do is they lay an egg. And as you can see in here, they put a little mud cap in between each. And then this is the cocoon. As that insect, as the egg hatches, it made a larva, it transforms itself and builds a cocoon inside of there. And then this is the leftover pollen after it's eaten its way through and made the cocoon. Another cool thing is that they actually lay eggs different sexes. So the male cocoons are towards the back and the females are in the front. So it's an interesting thing to see as you open up and go through, is they lay them in a certain way so that they can go through. So with our leafcutter bees, they carry pollen on their abdomen, and they are black and furry, yellow bellies, and honeybee size. They're pretty cool, and they will also, as you can see, make little, they'll use little tubes to be able to lay, but instead of the mud, they will actually put leaves in to pack in between their different eggs. The males emerge in spring and mate, and then the males die soon after. They are solitary also, just like our mason bees, and they can share different entrances with larger spaces. The mason bees like a very particular size hole for their little tubes. And you'll see, like I said, the little hole punch or a little round bite in the leaf. They will just kind of cut this perfect little tiny shape out. They make little nectar loaves to feed their young, and they are present in summer. So our mason bee is from February to June, and the leafcutter bee comes out about June or July through, I think, end of August or so. So if you can have pollinators from those two times. If you have flowers going through and you switch out and have different little tubes or nesting spots for each of them, it's a great way to be able to have good pollination through the main part of the year. So building your own mason bee or leafcutter bee house, a fun project to do with kids is to take toilet paper tubes or larger tubes, and you can actually buy the little wood tubes online. There's a handful of different bee sites that you can look at around the Northwest, or even on different online suppliers where you can buy the specific size tube for the different type of bee that you would want. And just cutting those and putting them inside, I believe it's around it's between 6 and 8 inches is how long of a tube they like. So cutting those tubes down to size, stuffing them in, putting them in an east facing area up off the ground. And then for mason bees, putting them out in February or March, and then for the leaf cutters in June or July. And then what you want to do is after those months, bring them inside. So in the late fall, it's a good thing to bring them inside and keep them in either the refrigerator or a cool, dark space in your garage. They actually go into kind of a hibernation as they're going through their cocoon stages, and then you bring them back out in the springtime. And that just helps with any sort of disease or pest issues that might happen if they're left outside over the winter time. So looking at our sweet bees, our sweat bees, they are closely related to the Agapostum and the Lasioglossum. They have very hairy hind legs. And like I mentioned, they are semi-social, and they oftentimes are ground nesters. They social colonies with daughters, and they're caring for their young, so they kind of group together. They do single nest and can establish in spring and then reproduce in the fall. They have very short tongues, so they need those flowers that don't have as long of a tubular type form that maybe a bumblebee would like better. They are generalists, so they will go to many different types of flowers. They will use the same entrances, and they can have really deep vertical nests, and then can create 2 generations per year. With also this Lego Lasioglossum, they are also generalists and floral of the different types of flowers. They can be both a solitary ground or rotting wood type of an area, and the hibernaculum for overwintering females can also be in rotting wood. So these are kind of the 3 main guys that we have here: the Agapostum, the Halictictus, and the Lasioglossum. And I apologize for not being able to pronounce these very correctly. We have our longhorned bee. So they are soil burrows and ground nesting. They nest in aggregation. They carry pollen on their hind legs. And as you can see in this picture, they're very, very hairy. They're super important for our sunflowers to pollinate in, and you most commonly will see them in the spring and summer. I have yet to see one of these yet, so one of the ones I'm going to be keeping my eyes out for this year. So the yellow-faced bumblebee, this is one of those main guys that you're going to see out moving around. I agree with the Urban Pollination Project in that they're one of the most important pollinators for tomatoes. So tomatoes, because of the way that their stigma and anther are situated in the flower, they need to be shook a little bit. And so the vibrations that the bumblebees give off is a great way to help that pollen to move around and to pollinate a tomato well. So if you have flowers on a tomato plant, but you don't have any fruit forming, usually it's because you have a lack of pollination. So make sure you're getting flowers out there for your bumblebees. If you don't have or aren't seeing enough, I have taken paintbrushes and also electric toothbrushes to my tomatoes to make sure that I get a good crop. So just keeping that in mind as a last resort. But as we know, pollinators and beneficial insects are way better at doing that than we ever will be. The western bumblebee is rare and has been in decline, unfortunately. They have seen a handful in North Seattle, but they are declining quickly, so we need to keep a special eye out for them. They're super good at pollinating our blueberries and also cranberries. A lot of the concerns that they're seeing is because of a fungus that has come through from raising different bumblebees and also habitat loss. Which I should mention too with some of the mason bees and even the leaf cutters is that there's different diseases, there's mites, and there's also other um, pests that get into those tubes if they're not cared for properly, which is contributing also to some of their decline. So making sure that you are taking very good care of those animals when you do have them so that we have healthy animals when we are increasing and trying to have more around. Some of the other bumblebees that you might see out there, the black-tailed bumblebee or the fuzzy-horned bumblebee. So keeping those eyes peeled, just be a little bit more present in your garden, follow some of the different insects around, track what plants they like the best. Some will prefer one over another. So then going to our honeybees. So these are one of the ones that we know the most about. And oftentimes that's because they have a commodity associated with them. So we hear about them more because of the honey, because of royal jelly or wax. And so we get to know more about them, but they are only just one of many of the different types of insects that we have out there. They're highly social, so they're very much always working together. They're communicating. An individual colony can have anywhere upwards of 10,000 bees in it in a healthy colony. Wild hives are oftentimes found in tree hollows, chimneys, and even walls. They are out later in the growing season, so it's really important to have our really late blooming plants. One of the ones that they like a lot, which is unfortunate because they are invasive, is knotweed and also blackberries because they're so late blooming. So making sure that we find some other types of plants that are really late bloomers for them is really important. They also, so the colony collapse disorder is a really big problem, and that's still trying to figure out exactly what that is. It's a combination of climate, of disease, and of predators and chemicals. People don't know exactly. They're still trying to figure it out, but that's kind of along the lines of what we're seeing. You need 1 to 2 hives to cover the work that 250 mason bees can do. So a colony can be 10,000 bees, and 250 mason bees can do a, a large amount of what that work can do. So, as I said, mason bees are ones we definitely want to make sure we have out there because those different hives, you need a lot more bees to do the work that just a handful of mason bees can do. Are flies. So people don't realize flies are actually really great at pollinating. So making sure you're keeping an eye on that. We have the bee fly, the hoverfly, and the green bottle fly. They're non-hairy, so they're less efficient at carrying pollen than bees. But one of the biggest things that they do is that they are predators for many of our different types of pest insects that are out there. They're attracted to those paler, dull, and dark toned flowers. And to plants that produce actual pollen, they like the funnel types of flowers. And they're really good at mimicking bees, which is kind of what you'll often see. It's easier to see because of the wings and their eyes on whether it's an actual bee versus a fly. So ants, they pollinate the really low growing flowers. So things that are closer to the ground or closer to the stem. They're often seeking the nectar and then by default picking up the pollen and moving it around. They do secrete a substance that is antibiotic properties and can actually kill pollen. So something to think about, oftentimes you will see ants harvesting and moving aphids around and protecting them because they're also eating what we call the honeydew that aphids are creating. So you'll see that on some plants, oftentimes on peonies, I will see it a lot. They're kind of eating the sugary bits that aphids produce also. So they're attracted to that sweeter type of nectar and also that honeydew. Sedums can be ant pollinated in the Northwest. So just a fun fact to think about there. And then there's a picture of a sedum that you're seeing right there with those ants on it. So the different beetles. So beetles is a really large family. They are some of the first insects that are visiting flowers. They like the more bowl-shaped flowers with the organs that are actually exposed because they don't have those really long tongues to be able to get in like some of the other insects. They like the white or off-white and green types of flowers. They like large solitary flowers. So they have room to move around, or different clusters of small flowers. But they just need that room to grow or to move. They're not as delicate or able to maneuver as much. And once again, also similar to the ants, they're not actually trying to find the pollen and spread it as much as bees are. It's just kind of an accidental thing that they are doing. A lot of them are very good at eating many of our different predators. And some species can also be harmful. So wood borers, among some other types. So just something to think about as you continue having them, but definitely worth always attracting because there is many good things about them. So I have a little video, which I'm not going to show here, but this link is in the resource page that I have put up for Christy to have. And this just kind of shows you a little how-to to build a bug hotel for the different types of insects. And here you can see a couple of examples that shows the different types that you can create. And it's just another fun project to do with kids or just to kind of add as an art piece even into your own yard. Anything from pine cones to sticks to twigs to moss to rocks, anything that can create a habitat for some of these different animals, whether it's hanging on a tree, stuffed underneath a shrub to attract something. We need to increase the numbers of these animals that we have because the least amount of pesticides and chemicals that we can use, the healthy plants we can create, the healthier environment, and the more diversity we're going to have in our gardens. It's not only a beautiful thing, but it's also just the best way to be able to have a nice, happy, healthy garden. And with that, I want to say thank you. And I would love to hear any questions from everybody.
Yeah, that was a lot of information. So thank you very much.
It's always a lot of information.
Yeah, I heard my clock dinging again. It was dinging 8 o'clock. So yeah, I'm surprised you're able to pack all that in.
I know. I was like,
that
oh
amount of
gosh, I don't
time.
know if I'm going to be able to get through it all.
No, you did it. So
thank you everybody for putting up with me in that speedy transition.
And we should have the slides from this posted on our resource page by tomorrow. It may take me a little longer for the video, but we'll definitely at least have the slides. So now we are ready to begin the Q&A session, and that's scheduled to run until 8:30. So if you haven't already had a chance, feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and Selena will get to as many of them as she can. If we have a question about your question, we'll just ask you to unmute for clarification. And if time runs out and we can't get to all of your questions, You can find Selena at the Garden Hotline. She works with a staff of other gardening gurus, and any of them can help you answer your questions. And I mentioned at the beginning, we do have one more set of questions we want to ask you before you sign off. So Selena, if you wouldn't mind launching that second set of poll questions. And just a reminder, if you answer the questions, you can enter a prize drawing for a 90-minute consultation with Selena or one of her coworkers at Tilth Alliance. Or we've got these two really great books, really great resources for figuring out what kind of plants are going to be best for attracting and keeping pollinators in your yard. All right, with that, let me get to the questions here. So the first question, I'm getting ready to plant milkweed seed after a chill in the fridge. What should I consider as far as soil and sun? And how enthusiastic will it become?
So milkweed likes, so they don't need super rich soil. Oftentimes you'll find milkweed in kind of shrublands, or like I'd like to think of like Eastern Washington, kind of the grasslands. So they like full sun. They like well-drained soil. They don't like wet feet. So a good sunny slope. We have them planted down at our farm in Rainier Beach, and it is in some of the poorest soil I've ever seen. So, and it's doing great. Just make sure it gets watered until it gets established. It doesn't spread super crazy, so you don't have to worry about it taking over a yard by any means, but it's a cool plant to have. So definitely get it out there if you can.
Okay, and as far as a question about feeding the bees, how would you recommend putting the stuff like nectar out so that bees can access them? Are there feeders or some apparatus? And I think you kind of touched on a few
I don't know about
for
nectar for
hummingbirds.
yeah, for bees, I don't know of any sort of specific food source. The only thing I know of is for honeybees in the early spring or late fall, people will put sugar cubes out for honeybees, but it's only to get them through until they can get to flowers. It's more of a water source for the different insects that I would focus on and planting those flowers, because yeah, the pollen is they're getting the nectar, which has not just sugar in it, which is why it's important to have flowers and everything else. Is there's iron, there's all sorts of other minerals that are in nectar for animals. So planting as many flowers as possible is going to be your best bet for that.
Okay. Next question is about ladybug larvae, which they remind me of little alligators too.
Yes, they do.
I cut my tall grass down late winter. Is that detrimental to ladybug larvae?
I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I see them year round. Like, I don't have really tall grasses in my own yard, but I see them around. They find a space here and there. I guess mainly just thinking about not having a super manicured where everything is completely cut down. It's when you see every perennial cut down to the ground, all the leaves raked up, and all your shrubs are just perfectly cut. That's when we're kind of losing that diversity that a lot of those animals need. So leaving some leaf piles for some of them, leaving some seed heads on a little longer in the wintertime for birds, leaving some sort of stems that might be a little hollow. So like one of the ones is like sedums. Their stems are actually hollow. And so leaving just like a 2 or 3 inch chunk of a couple of them at the bottom until the spring will help to be habitat. The larvae I've seen on other things besides just tall grass, but the tall grasses can be helpful. But I see the larvae on all sorts of other things too. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just kind of having that diversity, leaving it throughout the year is really going to help.
Okay. And someone's asking about a bee house that they put out last year, and they say, I'm pretty sure that the bees didn't use it. What kinds of parameters should a bee house have? And I actually have the exact same problem, but I'm pretty sure I know I don't have the right kind of plants out.
Yeah. So with a couple of things can happen. So with mason bees, making sure, like I said, east facing is often a good time or good direction because they need that morning sun. They don't like to be in super hot all day sun. So having at least morning sun is good. Um, they do need a little bit of a mud pile. So it doesn't need to be like a huge thing, but I usually would try and leave something that's just even about like that, like a little bare spot that isn't covered in mulch, and just make sure it's moist so that they have some mud to be able to gather. And I'll keep it near their hive or their nest box. Um, Making sure, I mean, sometimes they're not going to come to it. Oftentimes they will find it if there's enough flowers for them to forage on. So making sure you have flowers that are blooming in the end of February through June. And so it doesn't have to always be fruit trees, but that is one of the common ones that we'll see them on. So any of those really early blooming flowers, I know people don't like dandelions, but dandelions are great early food source for many of our bees. Um, I'm trying to think some of the other really early blooming stuff. Ribes, the flowering currant, can be really good for a lot of different animals. Um, Sarcococa is not generally a big pollinator, but it is an early blooming, so it can still be helpful. Rosemary actually blooms super early. So that's another one just to have around. We actually saw hummingbirds in February on rosemary.
Wow.
Um, so having some of those really early blooming plants is going to be really helpful. They also are going to find making sure it's the right shape and the right size that you put out. If you've had them there before and they didn't come back, sometimes the scent, if you want to keep, you want to put the old tubes out and not remove all of the old tubes and just have brand new tubes because they need to have some sort of scent to go back. So it's another thing that can happen. You don't want to wash all of their pheromones off of there. So
Okay.
I would try all of those.
All right. Next question. Do pollinators like Nicotiana? And yes, I had to look that up to know how to pronounce
Yeah,
it.
the I say Nicotiana. I don't know if it's this. It's they're both the same. Yes, they do. They are a great one. It's in the tobacco family. Those guys, they get really tall. They do really great for a lot of different pollinators. They tend to have a little bit more of that tubular flower. So I see hummingbirds and some butterflies on them more often. But they're a great one to have in the garden.
All right. And when you were talking about ants, someone is asking the question, is it a good thing then when my peony has ants crawling all over the pre-blooms?
The ants don't hurt them as far as I know. They're not eating the buds. They're not doing anything. They're just harvesting and collecting those aphids. Or the other thing that happens is peonies do actually secrete their own nectar as they're starting to open their buds. It's like a lubrication to help the bud open. And so sometimes that can also attract them. Um, I wouldn't be concerned unless the aphids start completely covering and causing damage to the peony, which at that point I would just hose it off really well, and make the ants go find them in a different spot and not on your peony.
Okay. Next question. I heard we weren't supposed to have bird feeders out for a while as birds were spreading a contagious disease to each other. Has that danger passed?
Hmm, that is a great question. I don't know. I would have to look in. Probably the Audubon Society would be a good one to check in with that. I do know one thing with bird feeders to always think about is that you always want to be careful that you don't have an excessive amount of just bird seed laying on the ground because that will attract rats. So being careful that if you do have a bird feeder, having some way to either clean up any extra seeds that are falling on the ground or a type of a feeder that is collecting that, because you will have a rat problem, especially in urban areas if you start to have that, because that's a food source for them.
Okay.
So just being aware of that.
And one of our participants responded about the bird feeders. Yes,
Oh,
we've been told we can put out bird feeders carefully now, but be careful to keep them very clean.
great. Thank you for that.
All right. Another question, is there a good book for identifying helpful Pacific Northwest insects?
Yes. I will have to look at our office. I have there's a library behind my desk. I will have to look there for specific Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of links I put on the resource sheet
Mm-hmm.
for identifying a lot of bees. But as far as insects go, um, some of the ones that we use a lot at the hotline are, if we can't identify the insect, Bug Guide,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's .org, is a
Okay.
great resource, and um, it's a collective site where you can post pictures, and scientists or hobbyists will look at the pictures and identify them for you. Also, the Burke Museum is a really great resource for sending in pictures, and their entomologists can help identify too.
Okay. I think I see one you were just talking about. It's bugguide.net.
.net, yes.
So
So
I'll add that.
they're a great one.
All right. The praying mantis that you get at garden shops, are they native or imported to the Pacific Northwest? And also,
They
how do you know if a nest has hatched?
they are imported. They're not native here. They can get to be a little invasive in some areas. They are normally found in hotter, drier areas. We see them over in eastern Washington more often. I am seeing them more over here, and it's just because we're getting to have hotter, drier summers, and so they're actually starting to survive more. They are, and that what could happen, it hasn't happened yet, but they can start to take over and eating some of our predatory guys that we want and some of our natives. So it's better to not import in if you can and attract what we already have here. As far as when a casing has already hatched, I don't know. I actually found a couple of casings at our farm in Rainier Beach, and I took them home to try and hatch them. They didn't hatch, so they might have already hatched. You should, my guess, because I have hatched them before in the past, it's just been a long time, so I don't remember. There should be some sort of opening that you would be able to see to know whether or not they've hatched. I would do a Google search, honestly. I'm not sure with that specifically. They're really cool, and I wouldn't say if you see them, like, still encourage them to be around because they are a good predatory insect. We just don't want to continue to bring them in.
Okay. And there was one more question in the chat, and that is, I'm setting up a wood pile with nesting spots for bees on top. Will any birds or animals that it attracts cause a problem for the bees?
Um, I mean, it's always possible that they're gonna get them as, like, especially when they're first kind of waking up. They're really lazy and they're slow to kind of warm up. They need to kind of rest and warm up in the sun. You might lose a couple, but generally the birds and stuff are going to be going after other stuff. In my experience, I've never lost all of my bees due to birds. They're usually going after a lot of other types of insects than different bees specifically. So it's a possibility you would lose some, but I wouldn't worry too much about the birds going after them.
Okay. That's, if anyone else has any questions, if you want to type them in the chat, or I think I changed the permission so you can just unmute and ask a question if you have one. I would take advantage of Selena's expertise here.
You also can ask me something other than pollinators too, if you have something that's you're just itching to know.
That's true.
I will do my best.
Okay, yes, you have, okay, one of our participants has a question. Devin, go ahead and unmute.
Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
So I have an issue in my garden where various fungi are affecting my plants. So last fall I had a late blight on many of my plants. And this year I had my peach tree, which was doing really well last year, has this curly leaf syndrome, which I've learned from the internet is also a fungus. and I can't figure out why I have so much fungus problem in my garden and how to get rid of it.
So peach leaf curl is very common in the Northwest because of our rains. So until you can completely make the rain go away, you're gonna have it, unfortunately. A lot of things people do spray for it. I don't like to recommend it because it can be harmful to some of our beneficials and pollinators. So what people will do is they will actually create kind of umbrellas for their peach trees in the spring and fall when it is super moist and wet, and it actually will stop the peach leaf curl. And so people
Wow.
will create, I know it's a little funny, but they'll create an umbrella that goes over and protects the leaves, because what it is the rain and the moisture hitting the leaves is causing that fungus to grow, which curls the leaves. There are different types of varieties that they have bred to be resistant or more resistant to it so that we can grow it here. But that's part of why we don't see a lot of peaches on the west side of the mountains, is because of our rains.
And is that the same true for the blight as well and the powdery mildew?
Powdery mildew you're always going to have in the Northwest because of our spring, and it's just the way our weather is. The thing with powdery mildew is it will go away as soon as we start to get into our warmer weather. One thing you can do to spray for it that won't hurt animals is you can do a baking soda spray where you mix, say, a spray bottle with water with like 2 to 4 tablespoons of baking soda, and then a teaspoon of oil or a couple of drops of dish soap, and shake it up and spray that on. And the baking soda will change the pH on the leaf, which will then make the leaf not a spot that the mildew will grow on. The other good thing to know with the mildews is that if you have powdery mildew, say on your roses, it is specific to that host. So the powdery mildew that grows on your squash or your peas won't jump back and forth. So the other thing is making sure you have good airflow. You're not, you have enough sun, or it's in the right environment, because the mildew is forming with high humidity at night, and then it's warmer during the day. So that's why we see it in the spring and the fall.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, the late blight, if it is actually late blight, sometimes that can be an issue where you need to actually work on rotating crops, and that's more of a disease that happens. Is it what did you have late blight on?
The tomatoes and the peppers, I think.
Yeah, so that is going to be something in your soil at that point. So making sure that you're rotating your crops and not planting those crops in the same place year after year, because it's building up in your soil.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay, we do have a couple more questions. Someone is asking about earwigs. Are they good bugs or bad? I know they're gross looking. I can tell you that.
I had an earwig in my ear one time. That was scary. They are very good. So they are good bugs. They are decomposers. So they're helping to break down the larger bits of organic matter. So like leaves that are like partially decomposed, bark that's partially decomposed. They are chewing that up and breaking it down. So they're really good to have. When you have too many of them, they can start to cause problems. So if you're starting to see an excess of them, that's when you're going to start seeing problems where they're going to be chewing on the bases of plants where they meet the soil, or maybe the roots that are down there. So to help with that is to just kind of make sure if you're adding compost that is more decomposed before you put it on, or spreading just leaves on top and not doing leaves and bark and compost. They are good to have. You just want to make sure that you don't have too many in one space.
Do you have any tips to deter the bunnies from eating my plants? I'm going through carrots and yams like crazy to bribe them, but they still eat my plants.
Oh, I wish I had a better solution for poor people. I have so many people ask about rabbits all the time. So a couple of things you can try. The first one is kind of gross, but people do it. You can order coyote urine online and put that on your plants or around your yard, and that's supposed to keep them away. I've never done it, but people swear by it. Another thing is rabbits don't actually like to jump as high as you would think. So putting a fence that's only about a foot high will help to keep them away. You can use bird netting, because it's at least you don't see it quite so much when it's that black netting until stuff gets big enough, and then the rabbits won't go after stuff once it starts to get more mature. They like the smaller stuff. Another thing you can try is they don't like really strong smells. So like peppermint oil, rosemary oil, taking hot cayenne pepper I've tried and used, where you put that in a spray bottle with a little bit of soap or oil and spray that on your plants. Just wash them really well before you eat them. But those are all supposed to help. The rabbits are really hard. They are everywhere in the city, urban and rural, and I have everybody having problems with them. So I'm sorry, but those are the only suggestions that I have at the moment for those guys.
We've got a couple minutes left. If anyone else has a question and just wants to unmute and ask it, go right ahead. I will tell you, this is the last workshop in the City of Bothell's series of natural yard care workshops this year. So thank you everyone who has joined us this year. We don't know exactly what our topics will be for next year, but I'm thinking we'll probably go with spring workshops again. I know we've gotten a lot of interest in edible gardening and container gardening. I think we were actually going to do a container gardening class before COVID hit, so we've had to postpone that, but I know we have a lot of containers for a hands-on class when it's safe to do so. And in the meantime, if you want to take any other gardening classes, I added a list of websites on the resource page, such as Tilth Alliance and the Saving Water Partnership, your local conservation districts, and Puget Sound Starts Here. They all are great about keeping lists of local classes. Many of them are free, some of them do cost money, but they're well worth the money if you do take advantage of them.
I would also just add real fast for a little plug for the hotline is that we have live Q&As on May 19th at 5 p.m. and also June 23rd at 5 p.m. So if you go to our Facebook page, you will have our Zoom link there. And we do, like I said, just a live Q&A. So it's just strictly for you to ask us questions. So we'll go through a little intro about who we are, what we do, but then it's really the hour and a half is for you to ask questions. So feel free to join us then also.
Wonderful. I'll try and put the word out about that as we get closer to the dates too.
Yeah, we just finalized those ones. So it's the Wednesday. So as long as those are the Wednesdays, then I got the dates right.
Okay. All right. Well, if we have no more questions for this evening, thank you, Selena, for the excellent presentation. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Again, we'll have this recorded, posted on the resource page either tomorrow or by the end of Friday, probably tomorrow though. And feel free to reach out to Selena at the Garden Hotline if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Happy gardening. Enjoy the, yeah, thank you, Selena. Enjoy the rest of the night, everyone.